Hi, I'm so glad to be back with all of you here today. I am delighted because we have a remarkable guest who has joined us today. She is a author, she's a journalist. She is the co-founder of a Muslim organization dedicated to fighting extremism and has been awarded a Senate of Canada 150 medal in honor of her advocacy. Raheel Raza, the co-founder of Muslims Facing Tomorrow, has been awarded with a medal in Toronto in February of 2018. And I think it was prescient because we really, really need to understand what is happening on the planet at this moment, not just in Israel and Palestine or in the Israel-Hamas war at this moment, but also what is happening with all of those protests on the streets globally. Why are we seeing so much rage and hate? What is really going on? And we need some deeper exploration so that we have a better insight. I mean, from a psychological perspective, I think people are suffering in ways that they had not previously. The level of conflict and confusion, and for sure, people who have experienced trauma in the past would find the events of today even reigniting things that left them feeling vulnerable many years ago. And this may be the case both for members of the Muslim community, members of the Jewish community, but also our global friends and allies who believe in democracy everywhere. Here we are facing a real threat to democracy. What does this really mean? And to my friends out there listening, I want you to know this is a pre-recorded show, but as you know, we always love to hear from all of you in our conversations about trauma recovery, relationships, and your work and life adventures, and your adventures right now as you are trying to bear witness to evolving mind, mood, health. Welcome, Raheel. Thank you so much for joining us. I am very, very grateful to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you. It's an honor to be with you. Thank you, Anna.
I love that. I was really thinking a lot about what is actually happening with Canadian mosques. I know that there's been a spike, a very severe spike in hate crimes, both in the Muslim community as well as in the Jewish communities. And I'm really concerned about, what's happening and what's really generating all that hate. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, first of all, I should mention to you that I'm also on the board of an organization called the Council of Muslims Against Antisemitism. This is a recent construct, about 3 years old. And even before October 7th, we as Muslims, and it's an all-Muslim board, were exposing anti-Semitism, talking about it, trying to build bridges, trying to figure out, as you say, where all this is coming from. But it's nothing new. Anti-Semitism, as you know, has existed for, time immemorial. The Jewish community, unfortunately, has faced the onslaught of anti-Semitism. But October 7th just put us over the edge, so to speak. I mean, you're a psychologist. I'm sure, you have some thoughts about, this PTSD or whatever it is. But, this is a conflict that's taking place in the Middle East. But the ripple effects of it, we are seeing here in Toronto, our own country, our peaceful, liberal, democratic country. And it's something that I had never imagined. I mean, hate has always existed. Every community has faced hate at some time or the other. It's always been there. But what we are seeing in terms of anti-Semitism, and the police statistics tell us that the instances of anti-Semitism after October 7th are way beyond even 100%. Like they have really, really topped. And it's very concerning. The Jewish community is scared, they're vulnerable, and it's not something that we want to see happening in our own country, and it should not be happening. This is the real thing. And as you had mentioned, it is happening globally as well. But social media, while it has all its advantages, can also be a tool for a narrative that is not always factual, that is not always true. It can be used as a PR machine. And I will say that Hamas, which is a terrorist organization, has used billions of dollars supported by Iran to put this machine, this PR machine, this propaganda machine into motion. And I would say that to a large extent, they succeeded in brainwashing people into just listening to one narrative and not the other side, which, as you know, is never fair. So, and the narrative, of course, has changed. On October 7th, we knew that, well, let me even go back further. On October 6th, there was a ceasefire. Then on October 7th, Hamas attacked the civilian population of Israel in a very, very heinous and brutal way. As the stories are coming out, and as we are seeing the images, and as we are seeing their own body camera images, we know that it was brutal, it was barbaric, it was a heinous crime that they committed. And then very soon they changed the narrative from this being a Hamas war on Israel to an Israel-Palestinian conflict. And then they changed it to a Muslim-Jewish conflict. And this is so dangerous when you invoke religion. Traditionally, classically, there isn't that conflict between Muslims and Jews. It has always been political. I'm an observant, practicing Muslim, and in my holy book, the Quran, the Jews are called people of the book. And we are very clearly told as Muslims that unless you respect people of other faiths, you won't get that respect yourself. But hate is such a poignant thing. Not even poignant. Hate is such a toxic characteristic. It overtakes everything else. It overtakes reason. It overtakes logic. It overtakes compassion. It overtakes love. Any kind of good vibe. And hate, as we have seen, then perpetuates itself into violence, which is now becoming more and more apparent on our streets. And, I feel frustrated, I feel helpless, because I am not in a position of power to, put in any kind of laws that would stop this from happening. But as a human being, as a citizen of Canada, as an observant Muslim, I can use my voice, and that's what I do. I speak out, I write, because this has to stop.
Well, that's another part of the conversation that is startling to me, the extreme courage that people like yourself are holding in the face of all this hate. And, what it really takes to show up and speak with a clear, steady voice about truth, about, the unbelievable amount of misinformation, the many misguided people. Like, one of the things that surprised me was the gays in support of Hamas.
Yes, yes.
And that is a very interesting notion, because I think what has happened in a situation like that is you have people who see themselves as vulnerable, who are oppressed, trying to align with people that they see as being oppressed. And you can kind of understand, this kind of connection with another group of people who are also struggling, and we should all join together and support each other. But, this notion that this community, this LGBTQ plus community, making an alignment with people who clearly would not in any other circumstance support them in any way, and in fact they would be at great risk. It goes in alignment with, this community showing up for in solidarity with Hamas. And I say Hamas and not Palestinians because I understand.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, I
Yes.
understand the plight of the Palestinians, and it's not confusing to understand that you can have an oppressed group of people who are actually being used almost as pawns by a very powerful terrorist organization. And we know, one of the big issues here is that so much of the funds that Hamas has taken in has been used to build a regime, a terrorist organization that has extreme power. So when people show up in support of Hamas, they're not understanding that they're actually supporting an organization that is very, very well funded and has made their mission very well known. Now, for the people who are listening, I want to make something clear that Hamas has some very specific goals in mind, and it started with their 1988 Hamas Covenant Charter. And they made it very, very clear in that 1988 covenant, which has actually been updated. It was updated in 2017. But if you take your time and you really read carefully, you will understand that 2017 update is a Trojan horse. And if people don't understand what a Trojan horse is, it looks like a gift, but it's actually filled with dangerous content that is ready to hold the same murderous doctrine in mind. So, what I want to say is that this initial charter, this covenant, has statements that clearly identify a decision that there is a goal for complete and total annihilation of the Jewish people in Israel, and the complete overtaking of Israel. Now, I'm going to read their Article 8 because people who are listening might find it interesting. This is from the 1988 covenant of Hamas. Allah is its target. The Prophet is its model. The Quran, its constitution. Jihad is its path. And death for the sake of Allah is the loftiest of its wishes. Now, I am really kind of struggling when I read something like that, because I read it as a kind of reconstitution of statements in the Quran that are using the word jihad and the wish for the death of the Jews and the destruction of Israel. And this is in contrast, great contrast, Raheel, with what you represent. Could you kind of help me with this?
Yes, actually, there's so much to unpack here. Let me go back for a moment and also reflect on what you said about the LGBTQ plus communities. I find it really ironic and sad. And I wonder if that community, which has had its own challenges and, has been oppressed in many different ways, but, here they're living in the West where they have so many freedoms and so many liberties that, it's something to be respected. Do they even begin to understand that in places like Gaza, if you're found to be a gay person, they will throw you off a roof, they will kill you. And they do the same in Iran. And, Hamas is totally supported by Iran. So what does this say about their ideology? Before you set out to support someone, you should at least understand what their ideology is. And if you can't understand their ideology, look at what they're doing openly and brazenly on the streets. I see the same with the feminist groups. They have not come out to support the women who were raped, but they will, stand up for so-called feminism, and it's a sham. It's a lack of understanding. To your second point, Hamas charter is very clearly about the annihilation of Israel and the Jews. And we all know that. And I wish everyone would read the Hamas charter before they come out on the streets and support pro-Hamas rallies. The Palestinians living in Gaza especially have been totally suppressed by Hamas. The billions of dollars that Hamas has received in funding from all over the world haven't gone to the welfare and the well-being of the Palestinians. They've gone to building tunnels and weapons of war. So, there was a time when Israel had left Gaza that people used to say that the infrastructure in Gaza was so fantastic, it could have become another Singapore. There was an opportunity for them to live like everyone else. And I've traveled to Israel and the West Bank 14 times, and I've spoken to people there. And the young people there, they say, we would like to just live a normal life like everyone else. We want education, we want welfare, we want hospitals, we want to live an ordinary life. But that Hamas has not allowed that to happen. So when the question comes up about the plight of the Palestinians, our heart is also bleeding for innocent people who are dying. But we have to understand that the cause of it has not always been Israel, it is Hamas. And, they have oppressed their own people. Now, terms like colonization, oppression, all of these are just terms that are used to deflect from the real issue. And what is the real issue? The real issue is hate, Jew hatred, anti-Semitism, the annihilation of Israel and the Jews. Do they want peace? No. They have had many opportunities. 5 times they have sat down and talked about peace accords. They don't want peace. This term that they cry out on the streets from the river to the sea, what does it mean? Where is the river? Where is the sea? And who is in between? It is Israel and the Jews. So it's a very clear indication that they do not want any kind of peace. And, this constant call for those who are supporting the Hamas rallies about a ceasefire, well, let me remind them there was a ceasefire on October 6th. Who broke the ceasefire? It was Hamas. And there will be a ceasefire when they put down their arms, when they surrender, and when they release the hostages as soon as possible. Otherwise, they will continue with their tactics. They will continue with their shenanigans because they will not stop until they have fulfilled their project, which is in their charter. And let me remind your listeners and you that this is not Islam. They are a cult. I am ashamed to say that they represent my faith. There is absolutely nothing they do or say that is in any way part of what I believe as a Muslim. And so they are a cult on their own. Unfortunately, like many other extremists, they use religion as a tool to justify what they're doing. They take they take lines out of context, they misinterpret them, they give them their own interpretation to justify. Now, every faith has its challenges. In the 7th century, when Islam came as a religion, these were tribal, and I'm giving you a little historical background, so maybe your listeners can help to understand. In the 7th century, these were all tribal communities. These were absolutely barbaric tribes. That's why the message came to make them more humane. And the way that these tribes used to deal with each other, even if a camel from one tribe walked into the area of another tribe, they would go and kill. They had swords, they would behead. And what you see Hamas doing is exactly the same barbaric behavior of pre-Islamic 7th century. But we are now living in the 21st century. And we need to understand that there are laws, there's humanity, there are conventions, but they think that they are above all of that.
Why would
They
that
don't
be? Why would
Because
that be, that we have people who think they are above it? And it makes me think a bit about the nervous system and how it actually functions, and how old, and this goes into epigenetics as well, where we start to realize that on some level the past pours into the present. So our reactivity, our nervous system is reacting today with a set of sequences that moves us into a fight mode. For some people, for some people, when we are faced with dangers of some kind, we slow right down and we start looking at the situation and trying to make sense of it. For other people, we move directly into the fight mode, and that is our primary form of response. And, unless we learn strategies, that's the place we will go almost automatically. It is the only response sequence that gets activated. And so, if we were actually ever going to make some change in these kinds of situations, it would demand that we start to learn about these automatic sequences that lead us towards hating and fighting. And it also makes me wonder about those protesters on the street, why they are so easily brought into hating and fighting so quickly.
yes, you've presented the psychological perspective, but without being a psychologist, let me go back to before 9/11, when my family and I came to Canada because we saw that our country of birth, Pakistan, was being Islamized, and I use the term Islamization as a term that is different from Islam, the spiritual faith, which is the politicization of the faith and the radicalization of my faith. So, Islamists are those who totally deflect from the spiritual message and just use radical extremist ideology. And when I saw that part of it was coming into Canada as well. I mean, I've spent a lifetime building bridges between communities, speaking out against violence, radicalization, and extremism, mostly within my faith, which was hijacked by the radicals. I mean, there is extremism in many faiths, but as a Muslim, I feel morally and ethically compelled to speak out about what's happening, within my faith before I criticize anyone else. So, we came to Canada to live in a country where we could raise our kids without fear of being under a totalitarian regime. But when we saw that ideology eventually made its way into Canada and got a strong foothold, we were very concerned, and it was a wake-up call. So I started writing and speaking about this and alerting people to exactly what you had said, that this is an ideology and it needs to be targeted at the root. You and I both know that no one is born hating. They are taught. So the big question was, where is this coming from? Who is teaching it? And if we know where it is coming from, and to a great extent, our leaders did know, but they looked the other way for a very, very long time. Now it's come back to bite us. And I hate to say I told you so, but when I go back to my writings and my books from before 9/11 and after 9/11, it is exactly the red flag that we were raising, that unless you go to the root cause of where it's being taught, how it's being taught, and why is hate being taught, it is going to manifest itself into the next generation, and then it will be too late to change this.
I'm interested in something called the fire hose of falsehood. You may be familiar with this propaganda model. It's actually based on some contemporary Russian propaganda modeling. And, a couple of the elements include high volume and multi-channel exposure to content. It doesn't matter what the content is. It just has to be an overwhelming amount of it, what's called a fire hose, right? And
Yes.
rapid, continuous, and repetitive. So again, no need to check facts or events. All you need to know is that this content is going to be at you all the time, continuously, repetitively, and then no commitment to objective reality. So this stuff is false. No need for really learning, reading about history, fact checking. It does not matter at all. And that even worse, the content is at times presented by credible sources, making people feel like they don't even need to check. They don't even need to really think about it, and then no commitment to consistency whatsoever. So if one narrative didn't work, go a different direction. It also doesn't have to be true as long as you follow what came before. High volume, multi-channel, rapid, continuous, repetitive, no commitment to objective reality, and then carry on over and over again in a cycle until something sticks. And there are some things that really have stuck, like From the River to the Sea, and we know what that means. It means basically the destruction of every Jewish member of society in Israel should basically be cast out or killed in some way or another, so that the entire region becomes identified as Palestinian. And there's no wiggle room here. Because we know in Israel you have members of the Muslim community, Bedouins, Druze, Christians, and Jewish Israelis living together, mostly doing pretty well.
Absolutely, you're right. When I was there, I talked to the Arabs and the Muslims living in Israel, and they would not want to live anywhere else. This is where they live. This is the country they support. I have been reading recently the stories of the Bedouins that are coming out, who also happen to be Muslim, but who have also been part of the attack. And this just shows that terrorists and people who are so violent in nature, they don't discriminate. And you're absolutely right about this analogy of this, the message being given over and over again. And, today, if you would ask an ordinary person on the street who may be not even that involved, they will not start on October 7th. They will either start in 1948, because this is where the rhetoric keeps going back to. They use they use historical facts to their own benefit. They manipulate them. They will take a sentence out of context. It's not that they see it in its chronological order. They will just use it randomly. And as you say, people don't fact check. They don't read. They don't use reason and logic. And then to add to this, when you have celebrities and people in powerful places and those who've made a name for themselves speaking out on exactly these same issues, the listener thinks, well, this is such a powerful person, they must be right. And that's exactly what's happening. If you look at social media, the propaganda from the pro-Hamas group and the Islamists is far more than from the Jewish side. Although I will say that I'm relieved to see that the Jewish community has started responding and has started pushing back. But there are a few things that stand out for me, and I do want to share this with you. In all the time since October 7th that I have been part of events, and I've gone to places where there have been hundreds of people. Some of them have been family members of the hostages that were taken. Not once did I hear the word hate. Now, this is huge. If the father of a girl who was butchered had stood up and said, I hate the people who did this to my father, I could have even justified it. But the word hate was never used. And this is the difference between one side and the other. It is so much in my face, and I can't get over it. There was also the screening of the footage that the Hamas terrorists had taken from their body cams of when they first came and attacked. And it is enough to, I mean, I was sick. I couldn't sleep. It is so horrific. Any human being who sees that would say these are not humans, these are animals. Even animals treat their own better than what they did.
Mm-hmm.
In the history of the world, there have been wars throughout the history of the world. And, there is people die, they're killed, there's all sorts of collateral damage. But what Hamas did on October 7th, and they did it intentionally after planning with the help of Iran for many, many years, this was not something that they decided to do overnight. This was very planned, well planned. It was strategic. It took the world by surprise. But it was so horrific in nature. And the celebrations that were taking place while they were slaughtering the Israelis is something no human being can acknowledge or accept. No matter how much they use the word oppression or colonization, or this still does not justify the inhumanity and the barbarity of their attacks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's also shocking because UN Women only more than a month after the
Yes.
events, and they saw the footage.
Oh, yes, they did. But
they,
there is denial even now. There is denial that the women were raped. I mean, why is it that the people from the Jewish community, when they talk about their trauma, it is always undermined? And it's been happening since the Holocaust, the Holocaust denial. No, it didn't happen. Now, of course, this didn't happen. The women were not raped. Who would even say that they were raped if they had not been? I mean, for the women's organizations and the feminists, I mean, I looked upon this, said, Me Too, unless you're a Jew. This question comes up. Where are the Me Too feminists? And this is very, very troubling. I mean, even just as a woman, as a grandmother, and as a mother, it's aching, it's heartrending. And it is something that needs to be talked about. So, the rhetoric, the narrative has to change.
Right. And yet, again, we talked about this before we started the show. There's this incredible place where courage lives inside of the human being, where we have to kind of find that inner sturdiness, and that is not an easy thing to find. And I think that we're seeing a tremendous amount of social weakness, where we don't see that many people who could have a voice speak with clarity about these issues. And I had just mentioned to you that I had just finished the book by Musab Hassan Yousaf, who was the son of one of the founders of Hamas, Sheikh Yousaf. And he, Musab, had to turn his back on his own community because he found that he did not want to have a life of hate. And what kind of courage did it take for him to do that? What kind of grief he must have experienced to turn his back on his own family, knowing that what he's doing, although it might have been in support of democracy, it meant that he was going to be alienated from the people that he loved the most. Like, what does that take? That level of courage. And so, when you say, these women who are in the Me Too movement, how come they're not rallying in support of these people who were the victims of this unbelievable, almost unspeakable horrors of October 7th, and they cannot show up somehow. They are frozen or in denial, or
okay. Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
You talk about this. So there are people who have a status, they're they're the performers, and they're popular, and they have this image that they must keep. In order to speak out, like Mossab, and I heard him speak, it's not just courage. It is the acceptance that this is what is morally and ethically acceptable. when people ask me, why do you say what you do? It's because I need to sleep at night, knowing that I did my little part my conscience will not allow me to stay silent. If you understand where that is coming from, it is a moral and ethical commitment to speak out. It's not about popularity. I gave up being popular after I wrote my first book.
And I'm going to interrupt you with that because I want to
Yes.
tell people what your first book is, because they'll be interested in this. I think this is the first one. There are a few, but if I've got this wrong, let me know. Their jihad
Yes.
is not my jihad. A Muslim Canadian woman speaks out, and I wonder if I could just interrupt you for a moment and have you explain what is the difference between the people screaming for jihad at the most recent pro-Hamas rallies. And I keep saying pro-Hamas, not pro-Palestinian, because, you got to understand where the money is coming from for these rallies. This level of organization could not happen without a huge amount of money being poured into it. There are people in Canada, in the US, in the UK, all over the globe who are actually supporting Hamas, and they are getting funded to organize. It's not just pro-Palestinians. I get the pro-Palestinian cause. I want the Palestinians to have autonomy, self-determination, peace, love, a beautiful community. They should have that Singapore you talked about a few minutes ago.
Absolutely. They deserve it.
They should have that. Good health care, education, loving families, safe communities. They all deserve that. There's nothing wrong with that. But there is a huge difference between people on the streets calling for jihad and the jihad that you speak about. Please help my audience to understand.
Okay, so there are, Arabic is a complicated language where a word can have more than one meaning. And this is why when we read the Quran, our holy book, we are told don't read it, understand the other meaning and read it in a historical context, just don't take it word for word. Now, there is a meaning of jihad, which is also an internal moral and ethical struggle. And that is what I like to follow. In the 7th century, jihad was an armed struggle because this, as I had mentioned earlier, the only way that they knew how to deal with each other, there was no round tables, there was no UN. I mean, the UN is useless, but there wasn't. There was no way that they would sit around a table and talk to each other. So the jihad manifested itself in an armed combat, in an armed struggle. What Hamas is doing is using that same concept of being armed, and they justify it by saying that it is a resistance. But what they do is they selectively read these portions. They don't go back to the Quran and read that when it says that if you are attacked, yes, you may defend yourself, but if the other side talks about peace, you must adjust to that as well. And in a war, you must never harm women, children, the environment, animals, and those who are not in combat. Very clearly, no gray areas. It is black and white. But this is the problem. They use selectively out of context the conditions. As far as I'm concerned, my jihad is an ethical and moral struggle of good over evil. Now, I'm very clear in my mind that Hamas is evil, and then there are good people, and that is who I need to work with. And I wrote this book, Their Jihad, Not My Jihad, after 9/11, to help non-Muslims understand that there is a difference between extremists, Islamists, and jihadists, and those Muslims like me who follow the spiritual message and who want to live in peace, love, and build bridges and respect everyone of every other faith, and those of no faith. So that is the huge difference.
Yeah, because I mean, absolutely, you can have I like that you said, and those of no faith, because you can have a really deep sense of kind of spiritual connection without it being aligned with any kind of faith.
Oh, absolutely. Humanity is above all. Religion and faith is a very personal conviction. This is between me and my creator. But on a day-to-day life, 24/7, as a Canadian citizen, as a mother, as a grandmother, as a human being, as a woman, it is my connection one-to-one with humanity. It is how I live my life. So, my tagline, even on my visiting card, has always been that humanity is one community. And this, by the way, is both in the Torah and in the Quran, that humanity is one community. And there is also the saying that, if you kill one person, it is like killing all of humanity.
Mhm.
But, do you think that any of the Hamas terrorists ever have read that or have said that or they understand that? And so, there is a huge difference in the ideology. And unfortunately, this hate is being taught to the younger generation. It is taught in schools. We know about the textbooks funded by Iran that are in the schools in Gaza, where they're being taught to hate the Jewish people. And again, I think that leaders, governments have to take action whenever hate like this is perpetuated and find out where is it coming from.
Mhm. I'm wondering what you think about why there's such a focus on Israel-Hamas when in fact there are some pretty horrific and outrageous things that are happening globally, like right now, to Muslim people, and why that's not being elevated to the streets. What are your thoughts about that?
That's such a great question. Just last week, I wrote an op-ed in the National Post about the selective outrage against Israel. And it goes back a long time. About 15 years ago, I was accredited with the United Nations Human Rights Council, and I used to go there thrice a year to Geneva to attend the Human Rights Council. And while at that time Israel was not on my radar and I was not an activist against anti-Semitism, but I was appalled to notice that all the countries that had appalling human rights records would say, oh, there's no human rights violations in my country, including Iran and Pakistan, who have terrible human rights records, would say, no, it's only Israel and the United States. And that's when I realized that this was very hypocritical and there was a selective outrage against Israel. So yes, if you look at what is happening to Muslims the world over, the Uyghurs in China, I mean, their organs are being taken. They have been oppressed and suppressed in ways that are inhuman. There is a conflict going on in Sudan. There are Christians being persecuted in Muslim countries. There are sectarian minorities within the Muslim community, like the Ahmadiyas and the Shias, who are being relentlessly persecuted in Pakistan. But you don't see Muslims rallying on the streets of Toronto about what is happening to these people. It's the Rohingya Muslims. It is happening all over the world, but they don't come out in the same numbers and in the same forms when it is something that is happening in their own countries. But if it is Israel or the United States, it is a very selective outrage. Even governments don't speak out. There is an organization called the OIC, which I'm sure you know, the Organization of Islamic Conference, which is 53 or 56 Muslim countries, which are an important part of the United Nations, and which is why you see the anti-Israel bias. But the anti-Israel bias has been there for a long, long time. It's unfortunate that people haven't been able to see through it and speak out about it, but I do. I took all these examples of the countries where there are appalling human rights. Iran is a country where they torture and kill women for showing a piece of hair. And yet, we don't, except for the Iranian resistance movement and those who are against the Iranian regime, you see that in Canada as well. And even they are being watched and, people want to stop them. But you don't see mass rallies about what is happening in these countries. In Saudi Arabia till a few years ago, they would behead people in the public square. But hey, they've got the oil money, so let's keep quiet.
Shocking. So, Israel is the only democracy in that region. And,
Yes.
It's very interesting because I was at a gathering of people a couple of weekends ago, and somebody was telling me they're very, very concerned about democracy. And I asked, what is it that you're concerned about? Because I'm not going to take anything for granted at this point, right? Like, I know what my version of democracy is, but that doesn't mean that everybody's on the same page. And this person started speaking and said, well, I'm worried about democracy in the Middle East. And I said, oh yeah, like what exactly are you worried about? Well, that Gaza is being taken over and oppressed, and that that Israel is trying to claim statehood, which I thought was a really, really, it was an indicator of how little information this person had. It's obviously Israel is a state, and it's the only democracy in the region. And I said, well, that's kind of interesting that you said they're trying to claim statehood. Israel is actually a country. They have statehood. And this person said, oh, no, that's not the case. And I said, really? But do you not know that Israel is the only democracy in the region? And they said, oh, no, Israel is not a democracy. And I thought, that is so interesting that this person who is claiming to know something knows so very little. And I always say, I start my conversations in this area with, look, I'm just trying to understand because I know much less than I could. I am not a scholar of this whole confusion that's going on, but I am trying my best to learn, and I'm trying to go beyond what I see on social media, so that I can actually go to some source books, some context, peel back the layer, look at what has happened over many, many years. Like, for example, how many times has this concept of a two-state solution been raised, going back to the Israel Gaza issue? And why hasn't it actually happened?
Because they always walked away from the table. And yes, Israel is the only democracy. And I wish those who question this, especially because ignorance is the root of so many problems, they should take a visit and see. It is one of the most diverse countries after Canada, I would say, that I have ever visited. And I was always impressed at the diversity and the freedom that the people have there. And, people don't realize that there are Arabs and Muslims in the Knesset, and that, there is a very strong representation there. So it is, yes, the only democracy in the Middle East where the LGBTQ plus community has all the freedoms that they would want.
I know that people have had to run away from Gaza and the West Bank to Israel because they would actually have lost their lives if they stayed in either the West Bank or Gaza. And then, they found that they were able to live peacefully in Israel, whereas they would have had their life threatened. There's something called the Dunning-Krueger effect. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's going back to psychology. It is this very, very interesting concept that people who have limited information about an area tend to use tiny bits of information that they have heard repetitively to overestimate their ability to understand very complex constructs. And in fact, it is such an interesting area of study, and it is so well researched that, this overestimation of our understanding, our cognitive biases that can affect our behaviors and decision making. So, this is, people running out onto the streets and claiming that they understand what it means, to be from the river to the sea, or deny that.
That is fascinating.
Yeah,
I would appreciate it if you can send me this link, because it just makes so much sense. I'm sure there is a psychological reason for why people behave as badly as they do. So yes, this certainly makes sense. So please send me the name, and I will take time to read this up, and maybe I can use this reference next time I'm trying to explain. It's so hard to explain, people's ignorance, their naivety, you call it. I'd like to give them the benefit of the doubt and say that, they are not educated, but the fact is that some of the highest educated, as you see from the celebrities who speak out, some of the highest educated people come out with the most gross, uh, statements. And people lap it up that, oh, so and so is so famous and they said it, so it must be right. But
Exactly. Yeah,
so
I mean,
yes.
it is it's really, really interesting. And this actually goes back to the whole vaccine issue, which became very hotly contentious.
Oh,
And
yes.
it started with again, a very prominent person who was very concerned, referenced a research study that was later withdrawn from the journal that it was originally published in, that made a connection between vaccine and later, parents who were very, very concerned about what was happening with their children and believing that their children were becoming unwell because they were taking vaccines.
Yes. Mhm.
But the actual research that it was based on was later debunked. And so, without kind of being fulsome in their gathering of evidence and information, they landed on this one thing and used it to push things forward forever without
Yes.
really saying, well, oh my goodness, like, is that still the case? Should I be reassessing my thoughts about this? So the Dunning-Krueger effect was based on a 1999 paper by Cornell University psychologists David Dunning and Justin Krueger, and they were looking at people who were doing a little logic grammar test. And they found that people who scored very poorly actually believed that they had done much, much better than they actually did. And, there's this very funny idea that, kind of in quotes, those with limited knowledge in a domain suffer a dual burden. Not only do they reach mistaken conclusions and make regrettable errors, but their incompetence robs them of the ability to even realize that they're making an error. They
Wow.
lack that ability.
Wow. That really, really makes sense. That definitely makes sense, because you would think that adults, educated people, would at least not be so stuck on one idea. I have evolved over the years myself. I wasn't always able to understand what the reality of the conflict is, and I think the ability to be able to learn something different, to change our perspective, to understand, the other side is something that makes us mature. Mature. One of the aspects of maturity, is the fact that we can change our opinions, and it is an opinion. It doesn't have to be set in stone. It doesn't have to be so rigid that one does not change, and one evolves. For me, it is a lifelong journey of learning. I've learned so much today from you, about the psychological aspect, and I would like to read more and learn more about it. There are not enough hours in the day for me to finish all my learning and my education and my research, but there's always something new to learn. Every time we speak to someone, there's something new to learn. If only we would keep our minds and our hearts open. But unfortunately, a lot of people have shut their minds and shut their hearts, and they're so rigid that they're not able to have a conversation about a perspective that is not the same as theirs. And so part of the work that we're involved in is literally building bridges, sitting one-to-one with people, talking to them, hearing what they have to say, and then giving them a different opinion to think about.
I'm also interested in the kind of constructs. I'm going back to something that we touched on very briefly, the victim oppressor constructs and colonization, and how we're seeing a real miscarriage of justice in many of the universities where they're teaching people to follow a fragility bias, where you look at groups that you identify as victims, and without a real depth of understanding, you identify the oppressor group and place them in this role in a very rigid way without fully understanding what that actually means. And from the perspective of colonization, I mean, we know that Jewish people have a legitimate claim to the area of Israel, and that there's coins from a millennium ago that identifies Jews in the region, and that this notion of victim oppressor is just so problematic. And I was thinking about what was happening with Elise Stefanik's interview and challenge to the presidents of Harvard and MIT, and how that was recognized as a big problem because as she said, does the calling for the genocide of Jews on the campuses, is that okay with you, basically? And the presidents of Harvard, MIT, and UPenn smirking and smiling and being unable to make a clear statement that this is an unacceptable conclusion. And I think a lot of it goes back to the so-called diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Which I actually call die.
Yeah, you're going to die from this. Exactly.
No, yes, it has killed free speech. It has killed discussion and debate. And, we're sort of coming to the end of our time. But I just wanted to, speak about this issue that I'm not an academic. I'm not a psychologist. So I don't go, can't go into the depth of this whole victim oppressor thing and the colonization. But listen, my ancestors were from South Asia, and, India was colonized by the British. So am I, as a third generation Pakistani, going to constantly invoke the victim ideology? This whole victimhood ideology is a crutch that is used by people to shut up the other side, because if you say you're a victim, then the other person, is gobsmacked. They don't know what to say. So this whole, yes, anybody can call themselves a victim anytime. If I want to be a victim, I can invoke many, many stories. But, that's a crutch. We are now, the colonization was over and done with. There's a lot of things that came, which were good from the colonization of the South Asian subcontinent. And so the fact that I can speak English is part of it. But, we can't constantly invoke the victim ideology. It is a way to deflect and shut up the conversation, and I'm not willing to do this. So, the oppressed and the oppressor, come on. The new thing now with the Ontario Human Rights Commission is that, Christmas reflects the oppressor and colonization. I've just written a very, very hearty article saying, come on, don't politicize Christmas. You've done politicizing everything else. And of course, don't get me started on the whole, the white man's burden. The poor white man has been pushed against the wall because, he is now unofficially the oppressor just by being white, and, has got no place in society. So that's a whole other discussion we can have sometime. But, it's been great talking to you. I appreciate your giving me the time. Thank you so much.
It has been really, really a great conversation, and I hope we will speak again. I will ask you to just stay online for a few minutes as I
Yes,
say goodbye to our listeners. And
yes.
Raheel Raza, she's published a number of books that are incredibly insightful. She is publishing regularly, and I've been following you. I've been reading some of your articles that are appearing in the National Post, and I know that you're on appearances with CNN, BBC, Fox News, CBC, and that you continue to do your work as a advocate for human rights and truth, and that you are making a huge difference in the world today. I am so grateful for this conversation, Raheel, and I hope we will speak again. And for all of our listeners today, please be safe, take care of yourself, be gentle with yourself, and continue to educate yourself so that you know what is true and not true, and that we can maybe come to some new places of light, democracy, and truth, and that we do not turn our back on the possibility of moving forward in a community that accepts all people. Be well, everyone.